courtroom was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Everyone inside seemed to be holding their breath. The wooden benches creaked softly as people leaned forward, waiting for the next move. The young millionaire sat at the front, his head lowered, his face pale. His lawyer had just walked out, abandoning him in the middle of the trial. For a man who once had everything, wealth, respect, and influence, this moment felt like the deepest fall. The whispers started like a low hum spreading through the crowd, each voice adding fuel to the fire. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others smirked as if enjoying his downfall. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The judge glanced down at the young man, his eyes filled with disappointment, but he said nothing. The prosecutor's smile was sharp, as if he already tasted victory. Without a lawyer, how could this man defend himself? Everyone thought it was over. They believed the case was finished, that the young millionaire's life was about to collapse. The courtroom became colder, heavier, like a graveyard. Time moved slowly. Each tick of the clock echoed in the room, louder and louder, reminding everyone that nothing could save him now. The millionaire's hands trembled slightly. He tried to hide it, clenching his fists, but deep inside he felt the weight of betrayal. He had trusted his lawyer, paid him, believed he would fight until the end. But now he was gone. Left alone, abandoned in front of so many eyes, he felt smaller than ever before. The silence wasn't just silence anymore, it was judgment. It was shame. It was the cruel laughter of 100 unspoken words. In the crowd, people whispered, "This is what happens when money cannot buy the truth." Others muttered, "He's finished. No one will save him." The young millionaire could hear their voices even though they tried to keep them low. They stung like daggers, cutting deeper than any lawyer's argument. He lowered his eyes to the wooden table, staring at the scratches and marks left by trials long past. He wondered if those before him had felt the same hopelessness, the same crushing silence. Then all at once, something unexpected broke through. A small voice, trembling but clear, rose above the whispers. "I can protect him." The words were so sudden, so pure, that the entire courtroom froze. Heads turned quickly, necks snapping toward the sound. The silence that had once been heavy now cracked open like glass shattering on the floor. At first, people thought they had misheard. Who could have said such a thing? The voice was not that of a lawyer, nor of a grown adult. It was a child's voice, soft, high, yet filled with surprising courage. In the corner of the courtroom stood a little girl, no more than 8 years old. Her dress was faded, her shoes worn out, and her small hands clenched tightly at her sides. She looked so out of place among the polished shoes, fine suits, and stern faces. Yet she stood firm, her chin lifted, her eyes bright with determination. Gasps filled the room. Some laughed, some whispered, others stared in disbelief. "A child," someone muttered. "What nonsense is this?" The judge himself looked startled, his brows rising as he leaned forward to see her better. The prosecutor chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as though the moment was nothing but a silly interruption. But the young millionaire heard her words clearly. They cut through his despair like a sudden ray of sunlight piercing through storm clouds. He raised his head, his eyes finding the small figure across the room. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a spark of hope flicker in his chest. The girl's voice might have been small, but her courage was larger than the silence that had haunted the courtroom moments before. The room, which had been filled with cold judgment, now carried something else. Confusion, curiosity, and a strange sense of wonder. Who was this child? Why would she say such a thing? And most of all, what made her believe she could protect him when everyone else had walked away? The judge cleared his throat, his voice deep as he asked, "What did you say, child?" All eyes turned to her again. The little girl's knees shook slightly, but she did not back down. She spoke once more, louder this time, her words ringing with unshakable certainty. "I can protect him." The courtroom erupted into noise. Some laughed loudly, mocking her boldness. Others whispered in shock, unable to understand her courage. Yet, in the middle of that storm of voices, the young millionaire sat frozen, his heart pounding. He could not believe it. This poor, fragile girl was standing up for him when everyone else had abandoned him. The silence of the courtroom had been broken, not by lawyers, not by powerful men, but by a child's voice filled with innocence and bravery. That single sentence had turned the entire room upside down. No one knew it yet, but her words would change everything. She stood there, a tiny figure in a courtroom filled with polished shoes, shiny suits, and sharp voices. Everyone turned their eyes toward her, confused and surprised. She was only 8 years old, a poor little girl with thin arms and a face that carried both innocence and determination. Her dress was faded, the fabric worn out from too many washes, and her shoes looked as though they had walked 1,000 miles. Yet at that moment she seemed taller than anyone else in the room. The people in the courtroom blinked as if their eyes were playing tricks on them. "A child here? What nonsense is this?" one man muttered. Others leaned closer, whispering behind their hands. Some laughed quietly, unable to take her seriously. To them she was nothing more than a fragile poor girl. But the truth was, she had already done something none of them had the courage to do. She had spoken when it mattered most. The judge's eyes narrowed, studying her carefully. He had seen lawyers argue, politicians lie, and criminals beg. But never had he seen a child declare such words with such conviction. His gavel hovered in his hand, but he did not strike it. Instead, curiosity flickered across his face. "Who is this girl?" he wondered silently. The young millionaire, sitting at the defense table, could not believe what he was seeing. Just moments ago, his world had collapsed. His lawyer had walked away. His so-called friends had abandoned him, and the crowd had turned cold. But now this little girl was standing before everyone, saying she would protect him. His eyes softened, though his heart ached. How could someone so small and poor think she could shield him from the storm that had swallowed his life? The girl took a step forward, her hands shaking but her voice steady. She didn't flinch under the mocking laughter or the heavy stares. She had known fear before. Fear of hunger, fear of losing her home, fear of nights where the cold air crept under the broken door of their small shack. But this was different. This was courage. The prosecutor smirked, crossing his arms. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She is a child. She cannot speak in this court. She cannot protect anyone. This is a waste of time." His voice was sharp, filled with irritation. He wanted to dismiss her as quickly as possible, but even he could not ignore the fire in her eyes. The judge raised a hand to silence the noise. His deep voice carried across the room. "Child, do you understand where you are? Do you know what you are saying?" The little girl nodded quickly, her braids bouncing as she answered. "Yes, sir, I know. I can protect him. I will protect him." Her words were simple, but they struck like thunder in the silence that followed. People gasped. Some shook their heads, pitying her foolishness. Others whispered, trying to guess who she was and why she would say such a thing. "She must be confused," one woman murmured. "No, she's brave," another whispered back. But inside the girl's heart there was no confusion. She remembered the winter night when her family had no food, no money, and no firewood. She remembered the knock at the door, the basket of bread and the blankets that kept them warm. She remembered the man who gave it to them, the same young millionaire now sitting broken and alone. He had helped her once, and she had never forgotten. To her, it didn't matter that she was poor or young or powerless. What mattered was gratitude. What mattered was loyalty. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "He was kind to my family when no one else was. He gave us food when we were hungry. He gave us shelter when we were cold. And now everyone leaves him. But I won't. I can protect him." The courtroom fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't cold or heavy. It was filled with awe, confusion, and a strange kind of respect. The little girl's words carried more weight than any lawyer's speech. They were pure, untouched by greed or lies. The young millionaire's eyes glistened. For years he had been surrounded by people who wanted his wealth, who praised him when he was strong and left him when he was weak. But here stood a poor child with nothing in her pockets, offering him the one thing no one else had: loyalty. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping the gavel softly against the desk, lost in thought. He had not expected this day to bring him such a moment. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some ashamed, some touched, others unsure what to believe. But the girl remained firm, her small figure standing like a wall between the young millionaire and the world that had turned against him. She was the last person anyone expected to rise in his defense. Yet she was the only one who did. And in that moment it became clear to everyone, sometimes the most unexpected protector is the one who changes everything. The crowd still buzzed with disbelief. How could a poor little girl dare to stand in a courtroom and say she would protect a man everyone else had abandoned? Yet the determination in her eyes made it impossible to dismiss her completely. People whispered, but behind their whispers, curiosity grew. Who was she? Why would she defend him? The answer lay in the past, a past that only the girl and the young millionaire truly understood. Years ago, before the trial, before the shame, before the lawyer walked away, there had been another moment. A small house stood at the edge of the city, its roof leaking when it rained, its walls thin enough for the wind to pass through. Inside lived the girl's family, her mother, her little brother, and herself. Her father had left long ago, and her mother struggled every day to put food on the table. There were nights when they went to bed hungry, nights when the girl hugged her brother tightly so he wouldn't cry from the pain in his empty stomach. One winter was especially cruel. The snow piled high outside their broken door, the cold creeping into their bones. The firewood was gone, the cupboards empty, and her mother's eyes filled with helpless tears. That night the girl thought they would not survive until morning. She wrapped a thin blanket around her brother and whispered promises she did not know how to keep. Then, a knock came at the door. Weak and tired, her mother opened it to find a young man standing there. He wore a heavy coat and fine shoes, but his eyes were gentle. In his hands was a basket filled with bread, fruit, and warm blankets. Behind him, a servant carried more food and firewood. The girl remembered how she had stared at him wide-eyed, too shocked to speak. He smiled kindly, kneeling down to her level. "Stay strong," he told her. "Winter will pass. Don't give up." His voice was calm, but it carried warmth that melted the cold around them. That young man was the very same millionaire now sitting broken in court. Her family never forgot that night. The food lasted them through the storm. The blankets kept them warm, and the memory of his kindness gave them hope. For him, it might have been a small act, just one of many good deeds, but for the little girl, it was everything. He had saved her family when they were at their weakest. Now, years later, the world had turned against him. The courtroom mocked him, the lawyer abandoned him, and his so-called friends had vanished. But the girl had not forgotten. She still saw him as the man who once carried hope to her doorstep in the middle of the storm. To her, he was not just a millionaire. He was the reason her brother was alive, the reason her mother survived that winter, the reason she herself had believed in kindness. As she stood in the courtroom, her voice trembling but strong, she remembered that moment clearly. She remembered how he had looked at her with compassion, not pity. She remembered how when her mother tried to thank him, he simply said, "If you ever get the chance, help someone else. That will be enough." The young millionaire sat silently now, but his mind drifted back too. He remembered the little girl's face peeking from behind the door, her eyes wide and hungry. He had not expected to see her again, and certainly not here, in a courtroom where his life was being torn apart. Yet here she was, standing for him when no one else would. For the first time in months, a faint smile tugged at his lips. It was not joy, it was something deeper. It was the realization that kindness, no matter how small, never truly disappears. It returns in ways one cannot predict. The judge, still watching closely, noticed the connection in their eyes. He saw something unspoken pass between them, something more powerful than any legal argument. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the story was no longer his to control. The girl lifted her chin, her voice breaking through the silence once again. "He didn't have to help us," she said softly, her words trembling but reaching every ear in the room. "But he did. When no one cared, he cared. That's why I will protect him now, because good people should not be left alone." Her words hung in the air like a heavy truth. The crowd, once ready to mock, now sat stunned. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Others blinked away tears they didn't expect. Even the judge leaned back, his expression softer than before. The hidden connection was no longer hidden. It stood clear for all to see, a bond born not from blood, nor wealth, nor obligation, but from gratitude and loyalty. A poor child and a rich man, tied together by a single act of kindness that had rippled into this moment. And as the girl stood firm in front of everyone, the world began to realize that this trial was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about something bigger, the power of compassion, and how even the smallest act of goodness could return when least expected. The little girl's words hung in the air long after she finished speaking. The crowd had grown restless, whispering and murmuring, yet no one dared to shout her down anymore. Something in her eyes, something in her voice had silenced even the cruelest of critics. She was trembling, yes. Her knees shook, her hands twisted together nervously, and her breath came in quick bursts. But her courage was stronger than her fear. Fear was not new to her. She had known it since the day she first understood hunger, since the nights when her mother wept quietly so the children wouldn't hear. She had known fear when the storms rattled the windows of their broken home, and when the darkness crept in without a candle to chase it away. Fear was like an old neighbor she had lived beside her entire life. But courage, that was something different. Courage came from the memory of a man who had once reached out his hand and lifted her family out of despair. Courage came from loyalty, from gratitude that could not be erased by laughter or judgment. The prosecutor, annoyed, tried to regain control. He slammed his papers on the table. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She is a child. She cannot stand as a witness, let alone a protector. She has no power here." His voice echoed, but for the first time it sounded defensive, almost desperate. The judge lifted his hand to silence him. His eyes never left the girl. "Power comes in many forms," he said slowly, his deep voice carrying a weight that made the room pause. Sometimes even the smallest voices carry truths that others are too afraid to speak. Gasps rose from the benches. No one had expected the judge to take her seriously, but the girl stood taller now, the warmth of his words giving her strength. She turned toward the young millionaire, her small face determined. "I will not run away," she said firmly. "Everyone else may leave, but I won't. He helped us when we were nothing, and I won't forget that. Even if I am just a child, even if I am poor, I will stay." The young millionaire's throat tightened. He lowered his head into his hands for a moment, hiding the tears that threatened to spill. All his life he had believed loyalty was bought with wealth. He had paid lawyers, friends, and advisors. He had given generously to those around him, but when the storm came, they had all disappeared. And now, the only one who stood for him was a child with nothing. Her loyalty was not for sale. It was real. It was pure. The crowd began to shift. Some people who had come only to watch his downfall felt their hearts stir. They whispered to each other, questioning themselves. "Would I have the courage to do what she is doing?" One man asked quietly. A woman wiped her eyes, shaking her head at the cruelty she had shown only moments earlier. The prosecutor tried again, his face red with frustration. "She is a fool. Does she even understand the risks? If she ties herself to him, she will be mocked, ridiculed, dragged into his failures. She cannot protect him, she will only destroy herself." But the girl did not flinch. She turned toward the prosecutor, her tiny hands balled into fists. Her voice rose, stronger than before. "You think I'm afraid of being laughed at? You think I care if people mock me? My family survived hunger. We survived cold nights, we survived being forgotten. What can your words do to me? Nothing. I am not afraid of you. I am not afraid of them. I will not leave him." Her words struck the room like a hammer. The silence that followed was alive with electricity. No one laughed now. No one dared. The bravery of an 8-year-old girl had humbled them all. The judge leaned back slowly, his fingers steepled under his chin. He studied her face carefully, then glanced at the young millionaire who sat staring at her in disbelief. For the first time, the judge's stern expression softened. He whispered something under his breath, almost to himself. Perhaps true loyalty does not come from age or power, but from the heart. The little girl stood trembling, but she did not back away. Her loyalty had become her shield, her courage her sword. Though she was young and fragile, her presence filled the courtroom like a fire that would not die. And in that moment, she was no longer just a poor child. She was a symbol of something greater, the kind of loyalty that fear could never break. The young millionaire finally lifted his head. His eyes, still damp, locked with hers. He gave a small nod, as though silently thanking her for something words could not capture. He had thought he was alone. He had thought the world had turned its back on him. But here, in front of everyone, this little girl had proved him wrong. And so the trial, which once seemed like the end, began to change. Not because of evidence or arguments, but because of an unshakable loyalty that stood taller than fear itself. The courtroom had always been a place of order, a place where rules spoke louder than hearts. But after the little girl's words, the room no longer felt like the same place. Something had shifted. The silence was different now. Not the heavy silence of despair, but the tense silence of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Every eye was locked on the girl. Some faces softened with respect, while others frowned in disbelief. A few shook their heads, whispering, "This is madness. A child cannot change anything." But others whispered something else. Maybe she's right. Maybe loyalty is stronger than law. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. His gavel rested quietly on the desk, untouched. He should have silenced her, should have dismissed her words as childish nonsense. Yet he could not. Her courage had touched something deep, something even he could not ignore. The prosecutor, red with frustration, slammed his palm against the table. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A courtroom is not a playground. We cannot allow an 8-year-old child to turn this into a circus. She doesn't understand the case. She doesn't understand the law. Her words have no value here." But the judge raised his hand firmly, silencing him. His voice, calm but heavy with authority, filled the room. "And yet her words have moved this entire court. I have heard lawyers speak for hours without saying anything as powerful as what this child just said." Gasps rippled through the benches. The prosecutor's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but he dared not argue further. The young millionaire sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the girl. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment, but never had he felt so deeply protected. It wasn't the kind of protection money could buy, nor the kind of loyalty people pretended to give when things were easy. This was real, pure, untouched. In the crowd, emotions clashed. Some whispered angrily, "The judge is losing his mind. This cannot be allowed." Others wiped their eyes, ashamed of how quickly they had joined in mocking the man moments ago. One older woman whispered to her neighbor, "Do you remember the last time you saw loyalty like that?" "I can't. Adults are too busy saving themselves." The girl's small voice had done what no lawyer, no speech, no piece of evidence could have done. It had forced everyone to look at themselves. The judge leaned forward, his eyes steady on the girl. "Tell me, child," he said gently. "Do you understand what it means to protect him? Do you understand that people will mock you, laugh at you, maybe even hate you for standing here today?" The girl's lips trembled, but she nodded firmly. "Yes, sir, I know. But I don't care. He helped me when no one else did. I will not leave him. Not today, not ever." Her words struck the courtroom like a wave. They weren't polished, they weren't clever, but they were true. And truth, spoken with courage, carries a weight that no law book can measure. The young millionaire's shoulders shook as he lowered his head. He tried to hide his tears, but it was too late. The court had already seen them. He, a man of wealth and power, had been brought to his knees not by his enemies, but by the loyalty of a poor child who had nothing. The crowd began to stir. A man at the back rose to his feet, clapping slowly. At first the sound echoed awkwardly, but soon another joined, then another. Within moments, a soft ripple of applause spread through the benches. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was the kind of applause born from respect. The prosecutor's face burned with anger. He slammed his papers again, shouting, "Order! Order in the court! This is out of line." But the judge did not stop the applause. He let it continue for a moment, then raised his hand. The room grew quiet once more, but the silence was different yet again. Now it was filled with something powerful, hope. The judge's voice, calm and steady, broke the silence. "Sometimes the law speaks with facts. Sometimes it speaks with arguments. But today the law has been reminded of something greater, humanity. This child has shown us that loyalty and truth do not belong only to adults, nor only to those with wealth or education. They can come from anyone, even the smallest among us." The girl stood taller, though her tiny hand still trembled. She did not smile, she did not boast, she simply stood, because that was enough. And as the judge's words faded, the meaning became clear to everyone in the room. The case was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It had become a mirror, forcing each person to see themselves. Would they walk away like the lawyer had, like the friends had? Or would they remember, like the girl, that loyalty stronger than fear could change everything? In that moment, the court itself felt less like a place of rules and more like a place of truth. And it was all because of a little girl no one expected. For a long moment, the young millionaire sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The voices around him blurred into a soft hum. The judge's words faded, and even the sound of the gavel seemed far away. His heart beat heavily inside his chest, each thud reminding him of something he had long forgotten, what it felt like to be truly seen. He had built his life on strength. He had learned to hide weakness behind polished smiles and expensive suits. In his world, crying was a sign of failure, of weakness no man of his status could afford. But now, in this courtroom filled with strangers, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Tears slid slowly down his cheeks. He tried to wipe them away quickly, but more followed, unstoppable, warm against the cold mask he had worn for so many years. The crowd fell into silence, stunned. They had expected anger, arrogance, maybe even a desperate plea, but not this. Not the quiet, raw tears of a man who had once been untouchable. The girl saw him cry. Her small heart tightened, but she did not look away. She had known tears all her life, tears of hunger, of fear, of loss. But these tears were different. These were the tears of a man who had carried too much for too long, only to realize he had been carrying it alone. The millionaire's vision blurred as memories flooded back. He remembered the friends who toasted him when he was rich, who filled his home with laughter when the champagne flowed, but who vanished the moment trouble arrived. He remembered the lawyer, once full of promises, now walking out the door without looking back. And yet, in the middle of that loneliness, there was a child, poor, small, trembling, who refused to leave him. The more he thought of it, the harder the tears came. They were not tears of shame, but of release. He had spent years pretending loyalty could be bought, that kindness was a transaction, that relationships had to be earned with wealth. But this girl's courage shattered all of that. She had nothing, yet gave him everything. The courtroom, once eager for drama, grew still. People leaned forward in their seats, watching silently as the man they had judged, mocked, and whispered about revealed a side of himself they never expected. The tears softened him, made him human again, stripped of the power and armor that money had once given him. The judge's gaze lingered on him, not with condemnation, but with a kind of quiet respect. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his certainty shaken. This was no longer the arrogant millionaire he had painted for the jury. This was a man broken down to his core, yet finding strength in the loyalty of a child. The girl, sensing his pain, took a tiny step closer. Her voice, soft but steady, carried across the room. "Don't cry," she whispered, though the entire court could hear her. "You are not alone." Those words struck him harder than any accusation, harder than any insult. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of his loneliness lift. Just a little. He gave her a small nod, his lips trembling as he tried to form words, but none came. And yet words weren't needed. His tears spoke for him. They told the world that he was not as cold as they thought, not as untouchable as his wealth once made him seem. They showed that beneath the title of millionaire was a man desperate for the very thing money could not buy: loyalty. In the crowd, emotions rippled. A woman clutched her chest, whispering, "I never thought I'd pity him." A man muttered, "Maybe we were too quick to judge." The mocking voices grew silent, replaced by something heavier: reflection. The prosecutor, red-faced and flustered, tried to turn the moment back in his favor. "Do not be fooled by tears," he barked. "They are nothing but a trick. He is guilty, and no child's words can change the facts." But his voice rang hollow. The people no longer looked at him with confidence. Their eyes were fixed on the man at the table, the one who had finally shown his humanity. The girl stepped forward once more, her small hand resting on the wooden railing as she spoke, louder this time. "He helped me when no one else did, and now when he needs help I will not leave him. Even if the whole world does, I won't." The young millionaire's tears flowed freely now, but with them came something else: strength. He sat up straighter, his shoulders no longer slumped with defeat. He still had nothing in the eyes of the law, but in that moment, he had something greater: proof that even when the world abandoned him, kindness had not been forgotten. The courtroom, which had begun the day as a stage for his downfall, was now transformed. His tears, the girl's loyalty, the silence of the crowd, all of it wove together into something unforgettable. It was no longer just a trial. It was a reminder to everyone watching that sometimes the greatest wealth a man can have is not money, but the loyalty of a single heart that refuses to give up on him. The courtroom felt different now. It was no longer just a hall of law and judgment. It had become a place where something deeper was unfolding, something human, something powerful. The millionaire's tears had softened hearts. The girl's courage had shaken walls, and now the atmosphere carried a strange weight of possibility. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He tapped the gavel lightly against the desk, not to silence the room, but as if thinking through every detail. The prosecutor, who only moments earlier had looked so confident, now shuffled his papers nervously. His argument suddenly seemed weaker, smaller, compared to the fire that burned in the heart of a child. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing a story larger than any trial they had ever covered. Cameras clicked, capturing the millionaire's tear-streaked face, the child's trembling but determined figure, and the audience whose expressions had transformed from scorn to awe. The world outside those walls would soon hear about this moment. The girl stood still, her tiny body almost dwarfed by the tall wooden railing, but her presence filled the room. She looked fragile, but her words had already proven stronger than anyone expected. She had not come with evidence, with files, or with legal training. She had come with truth, loyalty, and courage. And now the tide was beginning to turn. The prosecutor tried to fight back. He slammed his hand on the desk, raising his voice. "This is nothing but emotion. The law cannot be swayed by tears and childish speeches. We must deal with facts, not fairy tales." But his voice no longer carried the same authority. The people on the benches shook their heads, unimpressed. One man muttered, "Facts may matter, but so does character." A woman whispered to her neighbor, "I believe her more than I believe him." Slowly, the power in the room was shifting, slipping from the prosecutor's grasp. The judge raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Enough. This court will hear the truth in all its forms. Sometimes truth is written in documents. Sometimes it is spoken by lawyers. And sometimes," and he glanced at the girl, "it comes from the heart of a child." The crowd gasped, murmurs rising again. The prosecutor clenched his fists, realizing he was losing control. The young millionaire lifted his head, his eyes red but clearer than before. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the air change around him. The girl's loyalty had not only given him courage, it had begun to change the hearts of those who once condemned him. He looked at her with gratitude so deep it could not be put into words. The girl, sensing his gaze, nodded firmly. She did not speak again, but she didn't need to. Her presence itself was enough. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. A man from the crowd rose slowly to his feet. He was dressed in simple clothes, his face worn with years of hard work. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling, "I know this man too. He once paid for my son's hospital bill when no one else would help us. He never asked for anything in return." Gasps spread across the room. The judge raised his brows, motioning for the man to continue. Another voice joined in, this time a woman. She stood clutching her purse, her eyes wet. "He gave food to our street when the factory closed and people had no jobs. He never told anyone, but I remember." One by one, more voices rose from the benches. People who had once hidden their gratitude now found the courage to speak. Stories poured out, moments of quiet kindness, of generosity the millionaire had given without asking for recognition. The courtroom, which once echoed with scorn, now filled with testimonies of gratitude. The prosecutor's face drained of color. His neat pile of accusations suddenly looked small, compared to the wave of truth rising against him. His arguments, built on paper, were crumbling under the weight of human loyalty. The judge struck the gavel once, but softly, as though acknowledging the shift. He looked down at the millionaire, then at the girl who stood proudly beside him. "It seems," the judge said slowly, "that this man is not as alone as we were led to believe." Loyalty has a strange way of revealing character even in the darkest hour. The millionaire bowed his head, tears returning, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope. He realized he was not finished, not broken. The kindness he had once given had not been wasted. It had returned to him, carried by the voices of those who remembered and by the courage of a child who refused to forget. The courtroom, once prepared to see him fall, now leaned toward a different ending. A turn of fate had come, not through wealth, not through power, but through the simple truth that loyalty and kindness are stronger than betrayal. And it had all begun with the words of one small girl. "I can protect him." The courtroom that once felt like a graveyard now felt alive. It was no longer filled with whispers of shame, but with voices of gratitude, loyalty, and hope. The air itself seemed lighter, though every heart inside carried the weight of what they had just witnessed. The poor little girl had walked into that room as nothing more than a child, but she had left behind a mark that no one would ever forget. The judge sat quietly for a long moment, his gavel resting on the desk. His eyes moved from the prosecutor to the young millionaire, then finally to the girl. He sighed deeply as though centuries of human struggle were pressing on his shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice carried not just the authority of the law, but the wisdom of a man who had just been reminded of something greater. "This court," he said slowly, "has seen many arguments, many battles, many lies dressed as truth. But today we have seen something rare. We have seen loyalty stronger than fear. We have seen innocence stronger than power. And we have seen that kindness, no matter how small, never disappears. It returns when it is needed most." The room fell silent again. But it was not the cold silence from before. It was a silence filled with awe, respect, and humility. The young millionaire, his face still damp with tears, looked at the girl as though seeing the world for the first time. In his life, he had been surrounded by wealth, by people who smiled at him only when his fortune shone bright. But now, in his darkest hour, the one who had truly stood for him was a child who had nothing. That realization pierced deeper than any verdict. The judge announced that the case would continue, but his words had already shifted the ground beneath it. The evidence would be weighed, the arguments heard, but no one could erase what had just taken place. The girl's words had changed the atmosphere of the trial forever. As the crowd began to leave, many walked slower than before, lost in thought. Reporters whispered urgently, already planning headlines that would carry the story far beyond the courtroom walls. The child who spoke against fear. The millionaire's tearful defender. "I can protect him," the words that changed everything. The prosecutor gathered his papers. His face pale, his confidence shattered. He had come to crush a man, but instead he had been silenced by a child's truth. No law book could save him from the court of public opinion now. The girl walked toward the young millionaire, her steps small but certain. She stopped in front of him, lifting her head to meet his eyes. For a moment neither spoke. He lowered himself so that their eyes were level, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Why did you do it? Why stand for me when no one else would?" The girl's answer was simple, almost childlike, but it carried the weight of all her courage. "Because you didn't leave us when we were poor. So I won't leave you now." His throat tightened. He could not reply. Instead, he reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. It was not the grip of power, but of gratitude. That moment, captured by cameras and carried by witnesses, became more than just part of a trial. It became a symbol. The story spread quickly, moving from newspapers to radios, from radios to homes, from homes to hearts. People whispered it in villages, repeated it in schools, and shared it in crowded streets. A little girl stood in court and said, "I can protect him." Her words echoed far beyond those four walls. They became a lesson parents told their children, a reminder that loyalty, gratitude, and courage were not bound by age, status, or wealth. They were bound only by the heart. The young millionaire's life was never the same again. Though the trial was long and the battle hard, he was no longer alone. His enemies had money, arguments, and power, but he had something greater. The loyalty of those he had touched without even knowing. And at the center of it all was one poor little girl whose voice had changed everything. Years later, when people looked back, they did not remember the legal arguments or the long speeches of lawyers. They remembered a trembling voice rising above the silence declaring, "I can protect him." They remembered the tears of a man who once thought he had everything, only to discover that true wealth was loyalty that cannot be bought. And so her words lived on, not just as a child's outburst, but as a legacy. They reminded the world that even the smallest voice could shake the tallest walls, that even the weakest hands could hold the greatest strength, and that loyalty, once given, could outshine fear forever.